She stood at the edge of my property with the kind of posture that believed the world owed it deference. Hands planted on hips like the proclamation of a verdict. That smug HOA badge glinting on her cheap vest as if it were armor. And the first words out of her mouth were sharp and practiced. "You can't block the water like this, sir," as if a sentence could remake decades of history. She barked loud enough for the neighbors to hear, as if volume were proof, as if performance could replace proof. "You owe the HOA 2 years of unpaid fees, and this dam violates community standards." And I wiped the mud off my hands and looked her dead in the eye. Because some things deserve to be met without flinching, and this dam's been here for 40 years. My father built it before this neighborhood even existed, and she smirked like she'd already won. The sort of smirk that lives on damaged people who believe rules are a religion and compassion is a crime. "Well, things change," she said. "Either pay your dues or we'll handle it ourselves." And I laughed under my breath. An old man's sound. "Rough with soil and history? You touch that dam, you'll regret it?" But she wasn't listening, because when certainty sits in designer shoes and carries a clipboard, it rarely listens to anything that smells of earth or time. Behind her stood 2 guys from the HOA, clipboard warriors who fancied themselves law enforcement. One of them already taking pictures as if the click of a cheap camera could translate arrogance into ordnance. Because to them, this was about a program, a checkbox, a victory to parade at the next meeting. And those 2 men didn't know the line of rocks. They were pointing at wasn't just a pile of stones, but the heart of a small, engineered river system, the same stream that used to flood half the valley, before my father fixed it by hand decades ago, stacking stone and soil and sweat like someone who believed a promise to land and people mattered more than a glossy brochure. Karen pointed her phone and pressed record. "You're threatening the HOA, sir. I'll be reporting this." And I only shook my head. "You do that," I said. "And when your fancy houses start floating, don't come crying to me." But she smiled that cruel, confident smile and said, "We'll see about that," and then walked off with heels sinking into wet soil, leaving deep marks like a warning stamped into the mud, like a carving that said arrogance had a footprint. I watched her drive away in a shiny black SUV with the HOA logo on the side, and when the wind shifted, I couldn't help but mutter under my breath, "You just picked a fight with the wrong man." Because what she didn't know, and what nobody in that neat row of hedges and perfectly pruned lawns knew, was that I wasn't just some old farmer clinging to a stubborn patch of land. I had built that entire water system myself, mapped the flow with my father's maps and my own hands, and I'd kept cameras watching every inch of it long after the neighborhood planners put up their signs and drew their lines. Because some things you keep watch over for yourself and for the living memory of those who came before you. 2 days later, an engine's low roar woke me before dawn, and when I stepped outside, 3 bulldozers hunched near the creek like metal beasts in the fog, their lights cutting slashes through early mist. And there she was again, Karen, wearing a neon vest this time, as if that could remake her into authority. "Morning," she yelled fake sweet. "We gave you notice, you didn't pay." "So the HOA is taking care of it." And I walked closer, fists tightening. Not in the reflex of violence, but in the old muscle memory of protection. Because there are certain things you don't let other people destroy with the excuse of procedure. "You don't have the right to touch my property," I said, and she offered a handful of crumpled papers. Waving them like a banner, "These say otherwise." I snatched one, and the paper was arrogance printed in Helvetica. No court seal, no county stamp, just a mimicry of law signed with a flourish of entitlement. "You're trespassing," I said again, voice low enough that it was a warning and not a plea. "You destroy that dam and you'll be liable for every drop of water that moves through here." And she rolled her eyes as if liability were an optional fine on a ledger. "Yeah, sure, lawyer boy," she said. "Let's get this thing down, boys." And the engines roared to life with that animal sound of hydraulic teeth. Dirt flew, water splashed. And my father's old dam, the one that had saved fields and lives, started to give under the machines. I shouted to stop them, but the men with clipboards had already decided that orders from their president were their only conscience. And Karen stood there filming like a prophet of consequence, as if documenting destruction made it less criminal. And when the final wall broke a sound like a held breath released, and water turned from patient trickle to hungry river, surging forward and quick as anger swallowing the lower fields. and I felt my stomach twist not from fear, but from a knowledge deep as bone of what was now coming, because water remembers. And when a thing that has been held back is let loose, it takes with it everything it had been holding. She turned to me, smiling that impossible smile of someone who believes consequences apply to other people's lives. "Maybe next time you'll pay your fees on time," she said. And I looked at the stream, now freed and rushing toward the neat rows of houses where her million-dollar home stood high and aloof. "You have no idea what you just did," I said quietly, and she laughed. "Please, it's just water," and I didn't argue because arguing with arrogance is the same as feeding it. Instead, I stood and watched the current snake downhill, just as every contour of soil and stone I'd ever set up in my life expected it to. Because decades ago, my father taught me a stubborn lesson. Nature always collects its debts, and sometimes she comes with interest. That night, the rain came like a verdict. No drizzle, no polite storm, but a downpour that hammered rooftops and turned streets into rivers. And I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, watching lightning tattoo the valley and the path the stream had carved glow in sudden white like a map revealed by sorrow. And by midnight, the roar of rushing water echoed from down the hill, and the dam I'd loved less as structure and more as promise was gone. And a buzz on my phone gave me an unknown number, Mr. Collins. The voice shaky and thin, one of the HOA men. "The waters. It's everywhere. The retention pond overflowed. Basements are flooding. What do we do?" I leaned back in my old chair and said, "Call Karen," because she was the expert in starting things she didn't intend to finish. And the line died like many things in a storm. Probably power, probably connection, probably the thin myths of control. Part of me, an old human part, wanted to feel pity for them. For the neighbors waking to the gutted quiet of their lives awash with mud and memory. But then I tasted the steel of remembrance and thought of Karen's face the day the dam fell. Smug, proud, untouchable. And somewhere a car alarm began its lonely chorus, and people shouted into the night as water found every flawed place and made it worse. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, not to rescue, but to document, because there is power in witness. And I walked down to the creek with mud grabbing at my boots like the earth insisting I stay. And from the ridge, I could see it all unfold like a slow unmaking. Houses shimmered under floodlights. Water curled around mailboxes like it had come to claim what planning had promised, and Karen's glossy SUV lay half submerged, a black shark in suburban water. And she stood in the middle of chaos, drenched and furious and yelling into her phone. "Someone needs to fix this. Where's that man who built the dam?" I couldn't help the small smile that slipped across my face as thunder punctuated it. I whispered, "He's right here." And in the morning, the neighborhood resembled a place from the war stories my father used to tell. Cars stranded on curbs, fences ripped like paper, mud at thresholds, and the look of people whose tidy lives had been upended into survival. I stood at my property line, camera in hand, because truth becomes weight when you can show it to those who doubt. And my land, my stubborn square of earth, was dry, untouched, because the water curved away as it had always been guided to. Following lines my father and I had set so long ago, every drainage, slope, and stone placed with an eye to directing overflow where it might do the least harm. And that quiet satisfaction of a job done well sat with me like a familiar coat. Karen paced at the neighborhood entrance, dripping and makeup streaked down her face, shouting at two police officers whose uniforms could not hide the fatigue behind their eyes. "He did this!" she yelled, pointing at me. "He sabotaged the neighborhood after we demolished that illegal dam." And the tall officer with a patience older than his badge turned toward me. "Sir, is that true?" I held up my phone and said, "You want to see something?" and tapped play, and the video was merciless evidence. Karen and her crew ordering the demolition, laughing and brushing aside warnings, the bulldozers pushing where caution should have stood, her signature on papers that meant less than a county stamp. And the officer watched for 20 seconds and then looked back at her with a kind of tired comprehension. "Ma'am, did you authorize this?" he asked, and for the first time she didn't have the script ready. Her mouth opened and shut like a fish out of air. "I was protecting the community," she sputtered. "He's the one who built an illegal structure." And I handed the officer another document, an old county permit stamped and signed. The kind of paper that outlives bluster because it is rooted in process and precedent. This dam built legally registered.